Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest podcast on this supposed live streaming channel. Today I have a new guest, author and essayist Isaac Young. Isaac, for my listeners and viewers who may not have heard of you, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about your work?
Thank you so much for having me on. I am a author, a sci-fi fantasy author. I do a lot of cultural commentary on Twitter and Substack. I have books published on Amazon, and I've recently gotten into making audiobooks. And hopefully, by the time this this podcast goes up, my first audiobook will be available on pretty much every platform selling audiobooks.
What is this book, may I ask?
The Domes of Calrathia. The cover art is the same as my profile picture.
So if you're all listening in the car, ladies and gentlemen, I will briefly describe what his profile picture looks like. It depicts a man in a blue cape with a flaming sword about to take on a horde of what looks to be grey zombies. I know they have an actual name in the book, so I've actually been reading... I've been reading Isaac's Domes of Calrathia since he first started publishing them on Royal Road. No, actually, I started reading them when you were originally publishing them on Substack, so chapter by chapter. I've been very interested in Domes of Calrathia, and I think it's very engaging and worth a read. At the minute, you have a Kickstarter going on, and I believe you've got paper books on the way for all your backers.
Yep. So the Kickstarter actually wrapped up. It wrapped up about a month ago, so you can't contribute to it anymore. But so far, I've shipped all the ebooks. I've shipped all the audiobooks. I ordered all the physical copies for those who purchased the signed physical copy perk. They're being shipped to my address right now, and once they get here, I will, sign them and send them off. And for everyone who purchased the regular physical copies, I am still I'm making the orders literally right today, tomorrow, and those should be carried out quite swiftly. And then after that, I will post the physical copy on Amazon for anyone to purchase.
Very good. And I'm waiting for my signed copy, so I'm just as eager to hear how this goes as the next person in our audience. In fact, more invested at this stage. Okay, so as those of you who may have gathered on this podcast channel, supposed live streaming channel, I only ever make podcasts when there is a good topic or question which needs discussion. So back in the day, a few years ago, I made a video called It's Time to Move On. Fans and Critic YouTube need to... I've actually forgotten the name of the title. That's so embarrassing. That was the bracket section. But anyway, so the video It's Time to Move On, where I discussed how fandoms and YouTube critics and regular people needed to let go of franchise media and find new stories in media, particularly independent media. Later, I explored some of the ideas discussed in this video in several articles on praxiarchy, which I updated and published on my Substack. For everyone who's listening, everything which is mentioned will be linked in the description, including Isaac's links to his books, his Substack, etc., and of course links to my Substack and the videos which are being discussed at the moment. Then last year, I made another video with the help of a friend called Jared Trueheart, who's sort of a regular on this channel, even if you can call this channel regular in any way. And we together made this video called How to Move On. So in this video, I shared advice on how people could let go of branded media, move on from branded media franchises and fandoms, and find independent story and media which would actually fulfill them rather than really bad sequels, spin-offs, reboots, prequels, etc., all the stuff we've come to expect now from anything made by the mainstream film industry, comic book industry.
I actually read a a very funny tweet. Nowadays, we take for granted that movies are no longer made in good faith, and so when you hear a new movie announcement, like everyone just rolls their eyes. It does not matter. It does not matter what it is. It's just no one expects movies to be air quotes made for audiences anymore, which is a fascinating transition.
Yeah, exactly. So now, about these two videos I was discussing I made, I would often see under them the same sort of comments, which relates to what Isaac has just said, which is all these modern they'll go something like this: all modern media, sequels, reboots, etc., suck. So I'm the commenter under the video says, so I'm just going to watch the old films and read classic books instead. So this sentiment is everywhere. It's certainly under those two videos. It's time to move on and how to move on. Um, and it's course of action taken by quite a few people in response to mainstream media swill. And after noticing it, it made me just reflect and realize that while I explored the what and how, I never actually addressed the why. So to finish my quote unquote move on trilogy of YouTube content, I really want to get into the why and why people should move on and consume independent media instead. Because this is a question I found pretty hard to crack. Um, to sort of kick this off, I guess we need to describe what independent media are and what dissident media are. So now I throw the floor to you officially, Isaac. In your opinion, what would you say are independent media and art? Like, what defines something as independent and slash or dissident?
Well, I mean, those are two separate things right there. So I guess I'll just independent art is just art that is either funded from a very small budget, um, or basically a self startup. Essentially, that's what indie is. And there's some gray areas with some video game studios in that, but generally, the word indie means to like that connotates that you're not receiving a great deal of funding, and basically you're essentially allowed to dictate the quality of your product, or not, I wouldn't say quality of your product, but what your product is going to be. There's no vested interest. Like, let's say a patron funds you, for example, like they're going to have vested interest in the final shape of the product, whereas indie, you can determine the direction wherever you want it to go. So dissident media, on the other hand, is media I would characterize against the mainstream regime, essentially. And so I would say that pretty much by definition, all dissident media is going to be indie, but of course, not all indie media is going to be dissident, because you can have indie studios going along with the mainstream culture.
A good question is, can you think of any mainstream films which are dissident in some way? And I mean contemporary, I don't mean dissident back in the day.
See, here's the thing. The right wing has been playing this game for the past 8 years, where basically any film that comes out nowadays that has a kernel of dissident themes in it, that's what we kind of latch on to.
You're talking about
So
Starship Troopers, right?
I'm talking about Dune.
Oh, sorry.
Starship Troopers is a different story, but in terms of like very recently, like would you describe Dune as a dissident piece of media? Maybe, if you view it through a certain lens, though. Villeneuve, or however you say his name, tried his damnedest to make sure he could cram in that feminist message anyway, with Zendaya and her portrayal of Chani as this nagging, atheistic feminazi.
Yeah, I do remember that. I've got a suggestion. I haven't seen this film yet, and I want to see it. But Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ, would that be mainstream dissident?
I would say that's as close as you're going to get, but again, that always stood out to me as an exception generated by a very peculiar personality who happened to have a lot of influence and sway. But you're not going to see mainstream dissident stuff that often, and when it does happen, it's just exceptions to the rule.
Well, that's what I meant as an exception to the rule, because obviously to describe The Passion of Christ, Mel Gibson's film, as indie or independent wouldn't be right. It doesn't seem to fit. It showed in mainstream cinemas when it came out. It was talked about. It was basically a Hollywood production. So unlike anything, so I know a film. There's a film called Exemplium, which I have done a review of on my Substack, and you can go and watch it for free if you find the links in the Substack. And that's made by a Catholic filmmaker, and I watched his film, and that is an independent and very dissident film in that it's about a Catholic priest's fall into corruption as he makes bad decision after bad decision, all the while trying to fool himself into thinking he's doing the good thing, doing good things. It sounds like it's an attack on the Roman Church, but it isn't. It's actually it's like a modern thriller, and it's one of the best I've ever seen, unironically. But that was
Yeah, I was. Oh, sorry.
but that was done on a shoestring budget, as he said, and it's a feature-length film. It is a prime example of a dissident and independent film. Completely, you won't see it in cinemas, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was in the same group chats where that movie was being passed around. I talked to the guy behind it. I mean, I think that that sort of production is good. It was just in terms of it's a genuine attempt to be fiction and not a thinly veiled propagandized attack. It's just that I am so fatigued by my religion being portrayed. Well, it's obviously it's not portrayed poorly in the film, but just the connotations alone just make me just I'm too exhausted. I can't I can't enjoy this. But even though I have a great respect for the guy behind it, I think he's doing good work.
I thought it was a great film. It's actually probably the best film I saw last year. Obviously, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest watching it. It's a very good film. I'd also suggest reading Isaac's book. It's on Royal Road at the minute, and of course, you'll be able to buy it in future, as he was saying. And of course, you should read my books as well, because of course. So yeah, I agree with your definition of independent and dissident. I'd also say that just for people in the chat and the comments, etc., dissident, I would say, is contextual. It really does depend where you are in time and space. If you were to live in an ultra conservative society, then making anything remotely liberal in any shape or meaning would be dissident, and vice versa. So at the minute, what we'd call dissident media is often falls into the broad category of right wing, but that needn't always be the case. And in future, I don't think it will always be the case either. But what it means to be right wing, left wing will probably shift as time goes on, assuming nuclear holocaust doesn't happen across Europe. In the time because of current political events, which we're not going to discuss here. We have a good understanding. I think everyone does have a good understanding of what an independent piece is and what a dissident piece is. A good example of an independent piece, which is not dissident, but also not regime friendly per se, just kind of neutral. And yes, I will actually say that in sort of the political cultural war context, there is and are media which are sort of neutral, would be the amazing digital circus at current. We don't know what it will look like when it's finished. And Murder Drones, and they're both made by the same company, Glitch, but you could argue if they're independent or not, because they're actually funded by Australian tax dollars, at least partially. And the reason I say that they're independent and not dissident and yet not mainstream is because they're not really touching on any of like, how to put it, they're not really engaged with the culture war in any way. They're almost as if they've been made in a vacuum, if I'm being honest.
Well, I would say they still pay lip service to it. Amazing Digital Circus is certainly just because the abstract nature of the story. It's a lot farther away from doing those kinds of annoying lip services things, but it's still in there. I mean, there were lines that I could see it just bleeding through, just because it is the author's views. And murder drones, I'd be I'd push back on you. I think it's very for me. I saw the first episode and I was like, all right, I can see the the woke in this, so to
But
speak.
the thing is that I've watched all the series, and it's like it could have been made in the 2000s or in 2014, early 2000s, sorry, and in 2014, it almost feels like a throwback watching it. Um, I'd agree that it's not like certainly it's not dissident in any sense of words. Like the most dissident thing about it is, and hear this: there's two romantic relationships in the series, and they're both heterosexual. That is the most
Oh my gosh.
that is the most dissident thing about it, and actually, I thought it was quite welcome. So, uh, so yeah, I mean, I can sort of get your point. I don't think it quite applies to Murder Drones. I won't say much about the Amazing Digital Circus. I haven't seen the end of it yet, but for Murder Drones, it really does feel like it's in a vacuum. It was sort of created in a vacuum, and it almost it really sounds really harsh. It's almost as if it has no relevance, if I'm being honest, to anything. It's just entertainment. You watch it and you're entertained, and that's about all I can say about it.
Yeah, I mean what you find with a lot of decent fiction nowadays is it's neutral to the point where they can't really add any substance to it without getting into dangerous waters. Because if you start seriously commentating on things, and actually holding sincere beliefs, number one, you're either going to have to kneel to the left in some way, or number two, you get canceled.
Or in the case of something like Glitch Studios, which is receiving some Australian tax dollars, well, that funding gets cut immediately.
Yeah, and that's the name of the game here is just funding. I mean, we saw with the recent U.S. aid debacle that the left have quite the patronage network for their artists. It's staggering when you finally saw the numbers for the first time. I mean, we always knew it was there, but we're talking like billions being poured into just these all these activist causes.
You can't really be angry when your political opponents, though, actually know how to play the game.
I mean, I wouldn't say I was outraged by it. I was just like, oh. I would say the part that I was outraged at wasn't necessarily the left for being horrible actors. It was the boomers who were doubling down on the bootstraps discourse.
Oh boy.
because because I was like, all right, you have this unprecedented patronage network that goes against your entire belief system, but you're more angry at the Zoomers who are complaining about the job market.
Well, funnily enough, I wrote to kick off this year. I wrote a polemic about patronage for basically what you could broadly describe as right wing or dissident artists, and I posted that on the Substack. And someone on Substack actually not retweeted, sorry, what is it, restacked or something? I think it's restacked is the term. They restacked it on Substack, saying, guys, rather than sit around and wait for the government to fund us, we should just, you should just work hard and be a businessman or something. It was his restack was along those lines, and I was so annoyed reading it, his restack, because I actually never mentioned government funding. I was talking in a very small
Yeah, we're not going to get any
um,
government
I
funding for the next 20 years at
I never
least.
mentioned government funding. I mentioned individual, like, wealthy people who wanted to fund dissident content, and I sort of gave a very simplistic model of what that could look like. I didn't mention the government anywhere in my Substack, which was why it's annoyed me. And second of all, it's just a kind of it misses the point. You can't actually you can't, like, so many people can't actually fund themselves in the way to actually get the attention they need, etc. Um,
Oh yeah. I mean, like you talk to any indie author, it's basically everyone languishes in various degrees of obscurity. You need mainstream um, funding, or sorry, you need funding to hit the mainstream. Without that, the best you could possibly do, and this is winning the lottery, you could become like a content, like a large scale content creator. But even then, you're not a household name like someone like J.K. Rowling is.
I actually was discussing with a friend in the pub, and we sort of don't think that mainstream culture exists anymore, and we don't actually think
Yeah, I would agree
we
with
don't.
that.
I've discussed this in small bits in various articles and stuff, but I don't think that mainstream actually exists. I don't think there's a mainstream culture. I think the internet has fractured everyone and every fandom to the point where I don't like the term echo chamber, but it almost is like that. Everyone's in an echo chamber now, and the last three experiences I can say were mainstream in recent years were the Star Wars sequels, Game of Thrones, and Marvel Avengers Endgame, and Phase 1 Marvel films leading up to that point. Those were the last mainstream cultural touchstones, because everyone was watching the new Star Wars films, even if they sucked, and everyone was watching Game of Thrones, and everyone watched the Marvel films up till Endgame. And I don't think we'll see that replicated. And in terms of like books, the last mainstream sort of book phenomena I remember are Hunger Games and, unfortunately, 50 Shades of Grey.
Uh, I don't think it's just the internet though. I think it's just the declining social mores that when Hunger Games came out, you still had a lot of in real life communities where those things could spread via word of mouth, and I could reliably like talk with my friends about this. I don't think it's just the internet. I think it also has to do with just mass immigration, degenerating social mores, declining. But yeah, I think it just has to do with just the general breakdown. Even though that social media is basically a huge accelerant on top of that.
I know it's not politically correct, obviously, but multiculturalism is a thing and it is a consequence of mass immigration into Western countries of all kinds. And
If we had the communities of even like the 2010s, I feel like there would still be something of a mainstream, even with social media. But mass immigration has just totally destroyed that.
yeah, I mean, multiculturalism will just have an effect of dissipating mainstream culture, especially as different groups and individuals sort of don't know how to interact with each other. And before anyone says anything, I live next to a very cosmopolitan place, and it's not as if crime is high in that area. But what I am going to say is, you walk through that town. I walk through it, and I realize it doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't have a local character because people of various different ethnic groups now inhabit the area. It just isn't like, you can't describe a town as English, but on the other hand, you can't describe it as, oh, I don't know, African, Polish. You can't describe it as anything. It's just multiculturalism. It's just multicultural. It's multi-ethnic. You're not really sure um, on the public interaction level whose sort of social norms are above or like, the meta, for lack of a better word.
I mean, in terms of the communication, we're getting to the point where it's just downright they're speaking different languages than us. Literally speaking, like I walk into a grocery store and there's the Indian guy who's chatting in Indian on his perpetual 24/7 phone call with someone back in India. Yeah, someone speaking Spanish, and you have these distinct enclaves that are just oil and water existing in society that just don't mix. There's simulations a lie, folks. It's always has been.
So before we get too political, of course, because this is not what people have subscribed to this channel for, the important point we're trying to make here, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you imagine you're in conversation with these people of various different ethnic groups and religions, with varying degrees of fluency in the dominant tongue of the area, which in America and England is English, the question is, how do you actually share content with them, like books and stuff? Do you even like the same things in terms of fiction and stuff? So that's what we're guessing at here. Dovetailing away from the topic of these very political topics, which are so supercharged that we've probably blacklisted this video already. The question is, in this environment and in this area where, you know, mainstream films are bad, mainstream books are, let's not even go there, etc. The question is, why should people turn to independent media and slash or dissident media? Like, the big question is, why shouldn't they just go back to watching the same old films, which are, you know, classics again and again and again and again?
Well, I mean, the argument on the face of it of just going back to older media is something I'm very sympathetic to. I think it actually it does have a lot of things going for it. In terms of you're actually consuming more healthy, more spiritual food. Uh, and you know, I would say that as part, like, if you're an artist of any sort, you should go back to those older things from time to time and study them, because you can there's it's a treasure trove of knowledge, and yeah, it's a treasure trove. But in terms of, all right, if we're moving on from the discussion of, you know, are these things of the past worth engaging in? Sure. But as soon as we move into the discussion of, all right, what are we doing to produce culture now? Then that becomes just inhabiting these past frames becomes a very bad thing to do.
The thing is, I guess it will help if we think of a few examples to sort of contextualize the question. It's something I've asked myself as well. So, in the case of your book, Domes of Calrathia, you've said that a major inspiration was the Book of New Sun by Gene, or what's his name, Gene?
Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, Gene Wolfe. And I've not read the Book of New Sun. I've heard it's a classic, like it's, you know, a very good series of books. The question, I guess, is why should I read your Domes of Calrathia when I could get the Book of New Sun?
Actually, if I could backpedal a bit to finish up my previous point before we get into that specific point. All right, so I think you should engage with independent media, or distant media, sorry, rather than old works. For one, I think it's spiritually good for you if the media itself is spiritually good for you. Second, I think independent media produced in this zeitgeist is able to inhabit a frame that old media can't. You go back to older media and you see that they're products of their time for a certain people, for a certain place. I wrote about this in my recent Star Trek essay, where I basically argued the point that science fiction as a genre itself was never about exploring the future. Rather, it's exploring the present through fantastical means. And what do I mean by this? Well, you go back and you watch Star Trek, the original series, and almost none of it is a commentary on the future. Like, in our very present future of 2024, almost none of it is even on track. Star Trek thought rationalism and technocracy was going to pave the way for the utopia. Well, rationalism and technocracy are the very things killing the West right now. Gene Roddenberry foresaw a colorblind society. Uh, that society did not come about. In fact, the very diversity he promoted exacerbated problems rather than helped them or aided them. Star Trek's a product of the 60s, or whenever it was, going forward. It's not a product of the future. And so the same thing applies to us right now, is the products produced of our time are specifically of our time and for the people of our time. Whereas you go back and you're not you're engaging with the past, which is effectively it's a dead thing. It's not generative. It's not, the past can't produce any more masterworks than it already has.
So I don't like it when critics and cultural commentators and reviewers use the word relevant when describing fiction and stuff, because it's so cliche to go, it's relevant to our modern times. But unironically, the best thing about good independent media and, you know, good dissident media and the like is that they are relevant. they are relevant to the age. The good media are taking on the questions and sort of giving the observations. So for me, I've obviously written a trilogy, the High Realm trilogy, which is a set of family-friendly books. And the question I've asked myself is, okay, but why would anyone read this when one of my inspirations is obviously C.S. Lewis? So why wouldn't you just give your children the books, the Chronicles of Narnia, and say, have at it, and just go, oh, you can read it again and again and again. No need to worry about modern books, children. If I had to make an argument for my books, I would say C.S. Lewis was sort of tackling the problems of his day. I deliberately set out to tackle how the truth can be subverted, ignored, or outright denied. So, the villain in the first book is an unironic postmodernist. The second book, the villainess is a gaslighter supreme and safetyism overall. And then in the third book, it's just dictatorship where, you speak truth to power, you get cut down. And I'd say C.S. Lewis sort of doesn't take on those explicitly. He's sort of dealing with other stuff. That's my pitch, for lack of a better term.
If I can make an analogy here, so the argument of only engaging in older media, that's very analogous to saying, oh, hey, why do we need to build new cathedrals when we can just go visit the Notre Dame? Number one, the Notre Dame nearly burned down. So if you're in a constant frame of preserving things, eventually those things, maybe through the force of entropy, maybe through arson, maybe through a conspiracy on part of our elite, those things get destroyed or lost, or they just lose their resonance over the years. Second thing is, do you really want to live in a society that doesn't build new cathedrals anymore, that doesn't create anything new, that just has these relics of the past that are handed down? And that's certainly a society that's lost its vision, at the very least. It's dead. If it can't generate anything new, then it's just something that's waiting to be swept away. And the third thing, I think you should produce art because it's spiritually good for you. But I know that argument isn't going to fly with a lot of people in terms of funding, especially with some conservative influencers. But I will also say this: if you don't produce good art, that means the culture that does produces good art is going to overrun yours, run circles around your culture. A lot of conservative influencers like to complain about the dramatic influence of anime on Gen Z and the youth, and they think anime is it's the devil's medium. But the problem is that the Japanese are producing better culture than the Western culture is currently producing, and so you're getting colonized. To grab a word from the left, you're getting colonized by a foreign culture.
Oh, I love the fact you've mentioned the Japanese, because actually I discussed this as well with my friend in the pub. We discussed Far East Asia, Japan, China, and to a less extent Korea, but we focused on Japan, and Japan famously shut itself off from the world. I can't remember when they did it, but they basically just said, enough's enough, we want to be a hermit state. And that didn't turn out so well for them. And I think the story goes that during the American Spanish War, the Americans forcibly docked at a Japanese port to get supplies. They weren't allowed to do it. The Japanese didn't want them there. And the Japanese took one look at their modern battleships and went, right, we change now, or we will get destroyed by the rest of the world, which has just overtaken us. The idea of just like staying stuck in culture, not changing, being ultra conservative. Well, you look like Japan in the late 1800s, a nation which has been eclipsed by everyone else and rapidly needs to change or basically perish, which is my concern if we just go back to reading all the old classics without innovating or making anything new.
Yeah. I mean, the left won the culture war because they understood that culture is in some part political, where it's territory, and the battle lines are drawn by how many people are engaging with said set of ideas who are the people who are propagating those ideas. And to continue metaphor, you can movies and TV shows are artillery pieces, books are nukes. But they understood that art is political, and that was how they conquered pretty much every single institution. The problem is that they don't have any transcendental belief beyond the political, and so their art just becomes propaganda. You do need that component of genuine spiritual belief in reality. But art has always been political. Why did the great men of the Renaissance commission and patronage great works of art? Part of it was due to genuine belief, but part of it was for status, and part of it was to basically express cultural dominance. Like, here is where the culture is happening. Here's where the cutting edge is happening. That's why towns raised great funds for cathedrals. It was to worship God, yes, but you also have that secondary component of our town has raised this mighty cathedral, and now we have pilgrims from all over Europe coming to make pilgrimage here. So you have those second order effects.
Yeah, I would push back on the bit of all art being political, in the sense that, in theory, you can argue that everything's political, but then if everything's political, then nothing is. But it can't be denied, and I'd agree with you here, it can't be denied that there is art which has political purpose, and which isn't propaganda as well. Something can have political purpose without being propaganda. I think
Yeah.
it's about how honest it is with you.
I mean, the problem is that the left reduces everything to politics. So, I mean, if I create an art that is, just focused on my Catholicism, right? That's still political because the left will decry it as right wing and make it political because by virtue of the fact that they will draw battle lines around it.
Yeah, there is a thing
A,
where everything is
apoliti-
dragged into political realms.
Apolitical can only exist in homogenous cultures where there is a shared transcendental value system where you can have things that stand outside that things that we agree on, and things that we're not going to fight over. But the problem is that the left are in a total state where they will just declare war on you if you do not bend the knee. And so even if you want to be apolitical, you kind of can't, because they will go after you if you don't at least pay lip service.
But I think there's a difference between interpreting something as political if the author's intent is A, just not political, and two, if it's just being made up on the spot, really, by the people accusing it of being political. I think part of the problem, though, is that we are in a highly politicized age. Like, I don't think there's anything comparable in the past, really. Every single thing is politicized, like every single thing, including who should use what bathroom. So it's like you could the joke is that you can draw a picture of someone eating a hamburger and people will suddenly scream that it's political.
Unfortunately for the right, the fact that the left are willing to fight over it and gnash their teeth over it and go after people over it means that it is in some sense political. That's the unfortunate truth.
Unfortunately, anything dragged into the domain of politics becomes political. So,
and the left are willing to drag everything into the domain of politics.
So I think the best comic satire version of this is in Gulliver's Travels, where suddenly which way you had your egg up was political. If you ate a boiled egg from the top end, you were a Lilliputian. And if you ate your egg with the bottom end up, you're a Bearfusian, and there was a war over it. Now, obviously, how you eat your boiled eggs is not political in any shape or form, but it can be made political. It really can. I think this is I actually like this. We've brought up this point because I think this is because I've just had a thought here, but is one of the reasons that people just want to go back to old media, like classic old media, is because it's actually apolitical. So if you go and read Lord of the Rings, let's say, if you read the book itself, yes, there's political discussion about Lord of the Rings. I do know this, but I know this, but it's sort of it's almost detached from the cultural war issue in the sense of it's not being made by an author who's trying to make a statement about this age that we're in. It's disconnected from it. So, in a sense, you almost retreat from our highly politicized world when you go back to older fiction. And I wonder if that's part of it, because our independent fiction, as you're saying, is just de facto political because of the age we're in, even if we have no intention of it being so.
I mean, I would say that I don't think the problem is necessarily that the left are part of it is certainly the totalizing, but I think the problem is that the left have no transcendental value, or like basically any worldview that allows them to connect to the true, the good, and the beautiful. So Lord of the Rings has special merit because it does connect with the true, the good, and the beautiful. And whereas most of what happens today is either you neuter your work to be in accordance with the left, in which case you don't really have any substance to say, or you accidentally got caught on the other end of the spectrum where you're trying to dunk on the left, and that becomes the sole basis of your art, and then you've just made propaganda, but for the right. And I don't mean like I mean genuine, just trite. And to be an artist of our time, a good artist, I think you kind of have to have the ability to just look above that fight, even though you're just dragged in it. You have to be able to look above and create something that's an expression of your spiritual beliefs, and you need to have a spiritual foundation, because otherwise you're just going to get dragged into this catch-22 situation.
I mean, the thing is, though, that doesn't quite explain why some people are like, well, I'll just what, like, is Indiana Jones really pointing to the good, the true, and the beautiful? Like, we can argue that it is, but it's obviously not high spiritual work or high, like, intellectual, high artwork. But people I've had under my comments basically are saying, we'll just go and watch the old Indiana Jones films. We're not going to care about the latest Indiana Jones films.
I mean, there's definitely there's a contrast between high and low art, and there has been a slopification of media that's been going on for decades. It's not a new phenomenon. It's reached such a degenerate point that people are really beginning to wake up and notice it. But for something like Indiana Jones, okay, like we can definitely say that there's nothing of like high spiritual commentary like a Dostoevsky novel or whatever. But what makes Indiana Jones compelling is still he still embodies masculine archetypes. The women in there are feminine, um, and there is adventure and mystique, and there is at least a passing notion of the transcendental, even though I highly disagree with Steven Spielberg's portrayal of it. So there's a lot of elements that make it very consumable by the masses, even if it leaves someone who is looking for something higher and something more deep. It leaves them unsatisfied. But you know, I think what the YouTube critic crowd really want is they want their slop culture, but they want it to be entertaining too. But the problem is that slop culture that led to the vulgarity um, of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. It also directly led to the situation where we're in now, where just nothing is being produced that is good nowadays.
So, what do you say to like the people on YouTube, like these critics on YouTube? Like, why should they look towards independent media? Is a question.
Well, I mean, I can't. The problem is that nothing I'm going to be able to say to them is going to outcompete their bottom line. That's the problem. So there's nothing I can say to the critical drinker that's going to convince him, oh hey, you should look to distant media, because he's just going to look at his paycheck and he's going to be like, oh well, I'm going to make the next Star Wars video after after 4 or 5 times of saying I'm done with Star Wars.
I didn't name names in my video on how to move on, but yes, there is a problem that YouTube critics do. Some of them at least, do make a considerable amount of money from this. They're trapped making the same videos again and again. Fortunately, that's not me. Otherwise, I'd be doing the exact same thing that people like the Critical Drinker are doing. I'll say that frankly, I'd be doing the same thing.
It wasn't meant too much as a dig, just a acknowledgement of reality as it is. I like the Critical Drinker somewhat. It's just it was very humorous to me when his Acolyte series came out. On episode 2 of the Acolyte, he says, "I'm done with Star Wars, and Star Wars is done." And then episode 3 drops like a week later, and I'm like, "What?" So, what? You're clearly not done with Star Wars.
Star Wars isn't done yet, darn it. But
Oh my gosh.
okay, moving maybe away from the critics though, obviously the viewers of the critics, is there a reason they should move on from mainstream and look at independent media of all sorts? So books, audiobooks, films, etc. Comics.
Yeah, it's just because it's like again, like from someone like a Twitter conservative like Matt Walsh, the argument that I would be making is you should do it because if you want to win, you're going to have to sponsor culture that is if you want to win, you're going to have to sponsor culture that is receptive to your values. I mean, like every conservative is surprised that their kid, after watching like Nickelodeon and all the shows about transgenderism and LGBTQ, they're wondering why their kid is is transitioning themselves. But from a viewer perspective, I would argue that you should do it because it's spiritually good for you. And only distant media made in our time, with our time's zeitgeist in mind, can really tackle the spiritual questions of the age that we have.
For those who aren't spiritually inclined, I'd just add to this point that pretty much anything written and made by independents is better in quality if you know where to look, which I guess one problem is this is the bane of being an independent creator of any kind, right? Is how on earth do you let people know where the good stuff is? So I know a friend who's trying to fix that problem, but there is this massive issue wherein it's just like, where do you look? So I don't want to rag on the Critical Drinker too much, but I'm sorry, but I watched his film. Have you seen it, by the way? It's called Rogue Elements. Have you seen it, Isaac?
I have not. I read the reviews though.
Isaac, you should sit down and watch it. And
Okay.
you should sit down and watch it, um, because I mean, it's just bad. It I mean, it
uh,
is just I'm s I don't want to rag on a guy too much because this is his first film, and obviously he didn't direct it. He only wrote the screenplay, but the screenplay is bad. So it's the most cliche, generic thing ever. Self-referential. It has not one but two girl bosses in it, which is mind blowing. It's like Drinker. If we wiped your brain and told you to review this film and you had no idea you were part of making it, you'd be hammering it for doing the things that Hollywood does. So it also looks extremely hypocritical, and it's just bad. So yes, on the one hand, independent media can be very bad and generic, but some of it can be really good.
I
And
mean, the problem there that I would wager is that he just doesn't. He can't step out of. You can't. To be an artist, you have to be able to, like, again, have a spiritual grounding that allows you to look at the zeitgeist of the age and comment on it. But for most people, they don't have this spiritual grounding, and so all they can produce is imitations. Everyone wants the next Alien reboot to be good, even though it never is. Uh, but in order to make another Alien kind of film, you're going to have to be able to step out of all the things that made Alien and make something that is genuinely new in a new way. You can't just do repeats of, oh, let's add things to the xenomorph, oh, let's make the crew a little bit more diverse, oh, let's include this robot here. You have to be able to break from things in fundamental ways, and that again, that requires a spiritual grounding.
I would I would just sort of add to this that when a topic intrigues me, I can think about it for days on end. And the Critical Drinkers film, I just sat there and tried to think to myself, what is fundamentally baseline wrong with this because I can pick it apart in various ways, but I want to get to the actual root. And after thinking about it for some time, the only thing I can think of is from a screenplay writer's perspective, from a writer's perspective, the only thing that seems to make sense to me is that he didn't sit down and say to himself, what is this film story fundamentally about? Like, what am I questioning? What am I exploring? What is going on with this story? So he doesn't have a question. He doesn't have a topic which he's exploring. It seems that he just went, I want to make an action film. It's like, okay, is the action going to be the only good thing about it? Or the action's not that good, by the way, just in case you're wondering. What actually fundamentally is this about? Is it about, so the main character is called Ryan Drake. Is the story fundamentally about a man seeking vengeance at all costs? Is it a story about the sacrifices you make in his line of work? Is it about morality? Where do you draw the line between good and evil? What's it about fundamentally? Well, Critical Drinker obviously didn't ask himself these questions because I can't actually tell you what the film's about. It's basically a guy going in to rescue a Russian who keeps saying, please save my family, over and over again. And also, the bad guy in the story shot Ryan Drake's mentor, but since that's not really explored, since Ryan's emotional state isn't explored, and his ideas and feelings about this aren't explored really, we just get a vague sense that he's annoyed that his mentor got killed by this guy. It's like
Yeah,
it's like
it's a
there's no
person
question.
who's oh sorry. It's a movie made by a person whose cultural and spiritual depth is watching movies from the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think the drinker sat down and asked himself what the film was about or what he was trying to explore.
And with the
Or
girl boss thing, I'm pretty sure he just wanted a like he wanted a strong Bond girl, or one or two of those, and he didn't realize what that comes off as in the current zeitgeist.
one of these boss women in his film basically survives an RPG blowing up 2 feet from her.
Oh man,
Um, I don't think there's been a Bond girl that strong in any of the Bond films, and I haven't watched all of them, so I could be wrong, but I don't think there is one who can take that. I'm just saying. So I guess trying to get round to topic, the independent sphere, if you know where to look, there's actually books, films, etc., of both, let's say, spiritual quality and also of just writing and creation and constructive quality and entertainment quality. The thing is, the difficult thing is we can say, look, this is more entertaining, this is better for you spiritually, psychologically, and all that. We can say all that, and yet it feels like there's something missing to this why thing. I can't help but feel that we're missing something to basically make the case, and I'm not sure what it is.
I mean, I think the main problem is that we don't have a folk anymore that we're like we don't have an audience that we're really writing stories for. I mean, when I put a book out, I have a vague sense generally Catholics, Christians, people on the right wing. But there's no like if when Tolkien set out to write Lord of the Rings, what he was trying to do is he was establishing a myth for England, for the English people, and he talks about this. I don't have access to that kind of uh, folk. I don't have access to that kind of culture that I can add to. If my work survives, it'll just be on its own merits and not because it's part of a tradition. Or if it does survive because it's part of a tradition, it'll be because of the Catholicism of my books. But they won't survive because of the American people, whatever that means nowadays. It won't survive because of it being passed down as part of a community.
There is this issue of community. I discuss shared cultural experiences in both videos, and basically one of the reasons that people do music, art, stories, etc., is for shared social experiences within a community or a people or a folk. And, so I gave this example, I'll give it again. I saw one of the first ever showings of Marvel's Endgame in the cinema. So it was just a fun day with friends. What we did was, and I'm going to sound like an absolute nerd, but what we did was we played some Dungeons and Dragons in the late morning after getting together. Um, and then we played a card game called Werewolves. Then we went to a fast food joint to get some food before the showing, which was at midnight, and just chatted and had a good few laughs. And then we went to the cinema. And we had booked our seats, of course, because that was the only way you were going to see it. And we were at the front row. You had to crane your neck in a weird manner. And at this point, I was just like, I don't care if this film is terrible. I really don't care what the end film is like because I'm with friends. I'll talk about this with my friends. I'll talk about this with other people I know. This is fun and I like it. That's one of the reasons we do it, because even if the film's bad, you can still have a shared social experience with friends. I really want to say to people that, independent media has some kind of shared social experience, but it just doesn't. So there's people who are reading your book on Royal Road. There's people who are going to read it in paperback, but you're going to talk about it with people in real life, and they're going to look at you with a strange expression on their face. And if you try to say, "Oh, you should read it," it's like, "Well, who's it by?" Well, it's by an independent author. It's like, "Oh, that's kind of the thing." I think that's like the big elephant, which I've not figured a way to get around.
I mean, the person who figures a way around it is going to be a very like successful person because they've managed to like they'd be like if we could figure out a way around this problem, uh, our money problems would be no more. But until that day, it seems that most indie authors have to languish in some form of I'm not going to say poverty, but their efforts will not be rewarded monetarily. Which I think that's just a natural selection mechanism. Anyway, that's probably going to be good in the long term because the people who are in our sphere doing our kind of work are doing it because they're genuine believers and not grifters. Um, Now there's other problems because of AI and the absolute saturation of the market. But I think it might generally be a good thing in the long term that you can't make a living off of this because that means the people who are doing it out of a genuine spiritual desire to do so.
What do you make of the idea of subcultures, like real life ones, and trying to sort of foster and develop independent media and art among subcultures?
Um, all right, so I've been on Royal Road quite a bit, and you pick up on a few things in terms of so you have these very high profile authors who basically they you could describe it as genuine subcultures because they're making money over there, but the way they're doing it is basically they found a way to mass produce fiction, slop essentially, and that mass production allows them to bypass the issue of creating good art, or sorry, gaining an audience and creating good art. What they do is they give you this mediocrity because there's no way that you can write 10,000 words a day and post 10,000 words a day and have it be good. I'm sorry, like that. Maybe one person in the world can do that, but I sincerely doubt that a person can just like do that without any editing whatsoever and make it consistently good. So what they do is they create these vast troughs, and that's how they generate subcultures. And I suspect there's a fair amount of porn in there too.
I wasn't talking about online subcultures as much as I was talking about sort of in real life ones. So if you like weaving baskets, would you not form a kind of culture around weaving baskets and sort of develop your own subculture of people who appreciate weaving? I mean, on that sort of level where if you're meeting up with like minded people, let's say, and you share interests in art and you sort of create your own indie subculture scene in IRL. What do you think of that as a potential method? Because obviously, I think online, this is a I think this is a dead end. You're either hacking the algorithm using AI to help you, or you're producing absolute slop, as you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, in real life is going to be where the more permanent things last. The problem is that that's the slower, longer, and albeit more permanent route, but that's like long term thinking. Um, you're going to have to be thinking in decades. And I mean, Dave Green was recently talking about this. Um, the problem is that these communities don't really seem to be coalescing. They're like, you have one or two people who are the community organizers who pour like their heart and souls into this, but as soon as they're gone, it all falls apart. um and I think the reason that it all falls apart so quickly is because it's a political problem. It's about territory. People, it's very difficult for people in real life to attract other people and invest into these movements if these movements are ephemeral, they're not long lasting. um you know, the people in your community one year could be radically different the next, and it therefore it's so hard to make anything that's long lasting and permanent. I don't know how you get around that issue, really.
Atomization and just are very uprooted and deracinated sort of way of living does not aid this in any shape or form.
Yeah, these problems just compound on each other. They're all interconnected, and they're all feedback loops that make things worse.
It's just awful. And you add the internet to it, it gets even worse. I blame television and the internet for the atomization, if I'm honest. So I have this idea. I wonder if it could work. But basically, if let's say you're meeting people IRL who are artists, and you're meeting on a regular enough basis in your community at a cafe or something. Cafes are always popular among artsy types, so we'll go with that. Or pubs if you prefer. So if you're meeting at the meeting with fellow creators at cafes and pubs who live in your sort of area, and you talk enough, you could organically develop a subculture. So I need to do more research into how the everyone's favorite goth subculture came into existence. But the little bit of research I've done is it was effectively quite an organic thing, and it was based around various aesthetics, ideas, themes, etc. So I'm just wondering if that can be sort of replicated on some level. So one thing which is I think the reason why everyone talks about the goth subculture is it's a relatively young subculture. It isn't, but relatively speaking. But I think the reason people talk about it without goth subculture is because you could just look at what someone's wearing and tell that they're a goth. And I have this idea that we could bring shoulder capes back into fashion, or we could have shoulder capes as a marker of a subculture. So I'm just wondering if something along those lines could just organically work.
I mean, I really, here's the thing. I would love if there was a pub near me that I could go to, that I could meet like-minded individuals. Problem is that I envy the UK in this one regard. You can
What do you mean
drive.
in this one regard?
Well, man, I hear stories, man. I see stuff online. Keir Starmer doesn't seem to be. Oh crap! I might not be able to. I don't want to make you a target.
Listen, just so everyone is aware that we love our leader, Keir Starmer. He is a
Yeah.
perfectly fair, equitable leader. He's a good fellow and a good comrade. So, glory to the state and glory to Starmer, whose every action I support.
Sorry about that. Anyways, yeah, in terms of like, you can drive like an hour or two and meet up with people very easily. Meanwhile, if I want to meet up with someone I know online, I'm driving like the full day, and it's a minimum, and it's very frustrating. and that really precludes building IRL communities in America. And I don't know how to get around that. It's just the distances are so vast, and it's so difficult just to basically meet up. Forget meeting up weekly. I'm looking at, all right, here's one event every 6 months or so.
Yikes. Okay. Well, the distances in America are vast. In theory, though, what do you make of it? I guess of the suggestion, because in my mind, since mainstream media attention online is a no go, it's probably better to go via a subculture route create to get an art scene going, which is actually vibrant, where people actually engage with the art and know about it and have shared cultural experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Like in real life, that's the only way you're gonna have an art movement. It's only like artists physically in the room together, discussing ideas, reviewing, going back and forth, and building those invested connections. Because I mean, there's 100 Discord servers online about writing. And I posted my manuscripts to a few of them, and nobody gives you the time of day because no one wants to read your manuscript. They want you to read their manuscript. And the serious actors are the ones where you exchange it contractually. Whereas I read your stuff, I give you a review, you do mine. And that's where the serious people are. But it's not to the level of something like the Inklings, where you had these mutual friendships where I was not only reading your work out of obligation, I was reading your work because I'm invested in the friendship. And that's sort of where art needs to go if we're going to generate a subculture. Is we need real friendships, real connections, real investment. Because I can give you a review on a Discord, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, because maybe I don't care enough to give you my honest feedback. Maybe I'm just trying to be nice or whatever. It's impossible to kind of weigh in and take feedback like that when you're just receiving something from a absolute stranger.
Yeah, I'd agree. Basically, we need inklings everywhere. But I think that could help to sort of formulate an answer to the why. So pretend there is a vibrant subculture of independent, um, dissident artists of various stripes who produce stuff which is actually worth reading, watching, and engaging with. Suddenly, you can turn around to people and say, well, you should check out this stuff because it's good, it's relevant, it's fun, etc. But also to just say, and you get to be with the quote unquote cool kids and stuff. You get to be part of something which is developing rather than a passive consumer like you are when you turn on your Disney Plus and watch Acolyte 2.0.
You broke up a little bit. Could you repeat something? Like I heard half of it. Could you repeat the earlier stuff?
Oh, well, what I was saying was that this could answer the why question, or help answer the why question as to why people should engage with independent slash dissident art. Because if you imagine there's a vibrant subculture of people who are listening, reading, watching the same independent media, you can say, okay, the reason you should move on from mainstream media is because the independent media is not only just better in every way you want to view it, but also because there's a shared cultural experience, there's a scene which you can become part of or be next to, and that's always exciting. Like something which is actually alive and beating and moving, rather than when you just decide you're going to watch the latest Disney Star Wars thing because it happens to be out on Disney Plus, where you're just a passive consumer.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I mean, if we can figure out the problems of why, then the problems of how almost become immaterial, because people are exceptionally good at figuring out answers to how questions when they have the why answer. Um, Problem is that we don't have the why answer. We don't have an elite that is interested in generational thinking that would be required for developing an art scene. So the why is gone, and the grassroots people, they're too disparate and they don't have a strong enough why to band together to create something. I mean, what the distance scene is right now is basically a bunch of self-started entrepreneurs trying to carve out their own niche. And that's going as well as you would predict because the market is so saturated that it's impossible to find anyone.
Yeah, I. This is why I think the internet's basically a dead end. To be honest, I mean, you need it. Obviously, you need it. Obviously, the internet's becoming a dead end on this point, and yeah, I think it's very difficult to come up with a like. We've just spent over an hour talking about this, and still I'm like going, yeah, but it's really hard to answer this why question. I don't know, maybe in the fullness of time we'll get a better answer, and stuff will change at such a level that we'll actually have an answer to it. I mean, yes, just saying independent media is better is true, but there's a lot of it's just so much effort for the average person to find good independent media that they're just going to go and watch Indiana Jones again, for example. It's just there's an effort principle here, there's a accessibility issue here, and it's I'm going to be honest, it's hard. I'm not sure what the answer is. Is there like a 3-point plan or 3-point set of reasonings we can give for this kind of thing?
I think the average person generally trends towards the average common denominator. Sorry, the lowest common denominator without forces keeping them, without outside forces. I just don't have any other words to explain the phenomenon of the person who goes to watch Andor, even though that Star Wars has utterly betrayed them as an IP. They just want the entertainment right in front of them, and they'll go to the easiest light that they can, or the biggest and brightest and easiest light. And yeah, I think that's just it's an unfortunate reality, but I think that it highlights this just genuine fact about the human condition is that we prefer low energy um, solutions to problems as much as possible.
Right, well, we must stop dispensing all these black pills. So, before we conclude our discussion, I'll say very quickly, I hope that this has been of use to people, and hopefully this can be part of a wider discourse on this matter and topic, and hopefully we can come up with answers in the fullness of time. But we're not going to end the podcast there on such a dour note. So, Isaac, I want you to give me an argument as to why I should read Domes of Calrathia.
Well, I mean, you brought up earlier comparing and contrasting Domes of Calrathia versus Book of the New Sun. Why read this book when and just read Book of the New Sun? Well, I'd say first off, I was inspired by Gene Wolfe, but I'm not the sort of person who copies, who just literally just like plagiarizes. I like all artists take their inspirations from somewhere. I would say my content in terms of what the Domes of Calrathia is going for is vastly different than Book of the New Sun, even though they might be similar on superficial qualities. I would say that the primary difference between my work is I wrote Domes of Calrathia as a reaction to collapse in my lifetime. Whereas Gene Wolfe was writing Book of the New Sun as this speculative, very esoteric, abstract work. Abstract's probably the wrong word for it, but he wrote it as a speculative work. He didn't write it as part of an experience that he viscerally lives through every single day. And so that's probably the biggest draw, I would say, that you would choose Domes of Calrathia over Book of the New Sun.
Sorry, it just sounds like you've just said, by the way, guys, my book is not Book of New Sun. So just pretend that we have no idea what the Book of New Sun is. Tell me why I should read your book.
Fair enough. All right, so Book of the New Sun, it's set in the far future. It's set in a dying Earth story. And the story
Domes of Calrathia.
Oh, Domes of Calrathia. Okay. All right. So actually, my story is actually in many ways the opposite of Book of the New Sun, because my story is set in the distant past. It's set in the antediluvian period. It is science fiction. There's a lot of stories that there you have the trope of the advanced precursor civilizations. In science fiction, they're generally aliens. In fantasy, you have stuff like Atlantis. Basically, my story is set during the collapse of this precursor civilization. And the Domes of Calrathia, the story itself, the thrust itself, is about in layman's terms, a pilgrimage, a final pilgrimage across this frozen wasteland. And the story is dealing with questions about collapse, questions about living in a time when every institution has betrayed you, how to live honorably in a dishonorable time, and going up against almost Lovecraftian forces that are conspiring against you, whether that just be the onset of this eternal winter that is affecting the setting, or from actual entities that are out there that are demon-esque in nature.
Okay, that sounds more like it. Is there action?
Oh yeah, there's plenty of action in it. I took inspirations from John Carter, from actually I'd say primarily John Carter for the action sequences. I try to keep a healthy balance of action, dialogue, and I don't want to say dialectics, but exploring themes probably would be a better way to put it.
Philosophy.
Philosophy, maybe.
Is there any questions you have or anything you wanted to say before we close?
I don't want to end the stream on a black pill. So I guess I'll end it with saying that there's a lot of hope for the future for the right wing in terms of politically, at least on this side of the pond. I know that I know you guys over there are going through some difficult times, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for the future. And I think that despite market saturation, that means that indie authors will have to come up with new strategies in surviving and thriving in modern environments. One of those strategies that I'm adopting is creating audiobooks, because I think audiobooks are a much easier sell to people than physical books are nowadays, even ebooks. And so I think that the ways in which we can create art and the ways in which we have traditionally understood art, I think they're shifting, not due in least because of AI. And I think that, it as equally as these things are terrible scourges on the traditional avenues of entertainment, there's also a lot of opportunities for people who are willing to innovate and deliver art in new mediums that are still fairly underexplored, I would argue.
I've been dispensing the black pills, I guess, as well, but I actually am sort of hopeful for the future in the sense that one thing I look at the AI thing, what it says to me is that physical art, like actual drawings, hand painting, photography which is not digital, that is going to make a comeback. I strongly believe it. That will make a comeback because of AI. People will start going online, they'll see digital art, and they will just go, I don't know if it's been made by a human or if it's been made by a machine. And for people who care about that a lot, they're going to move away from the internet and go into the real life more, and they're going to try and encounter art on a physical level. I think physical books will actually make a comeback as well, and I think this can only be positive, that stuff will become more physical and more real again. And I think people who really care about this are going to come offline more, and I think that can only be positive in the future. So, with that note of positivity, thank you all for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all have an excellent day.